I'm Eric Halivni, sitting with Suzy Eban in Herzliya, November 18th, 2009, for Toldot Israel.
Repeat, because abroad they don't know Evan, they know Eban,
Okay,
since it's in English.
okay. So I'm Eric Halivni, sitting with Suzy Eban, November 18th, 2009, in Herzliya for Toldot Israel. Why don't you begin by telling me a little bit about your family growing up? Your parents, where they're from, where you lived, siblings.
Well, the family is all over the world in a way, but the Israeli roots that are very strong, both on my father and on my mother's side. On my father's side, it was Neve Tzedek. My parents, my father was born there. I think it was Neve Shalom, which became Neve Tzedek. And my mother was born in Jerusalem. And my father studied engineering in France. There were lots of Jewish students from Russia in Nancy, eastern France, on the border of Alsace. And he got his first job at the Suez Canal Company in Ismailia, being director of the electricity from Ismailia to Port Said, from Ismailia to Suez. And I was born in Ismailia, as was my brother and my two sisters. And you'll be interested that we spoke Hebrew. I went to French nuns not knowing a word of French, because at home we spoke Hebrew, and my parents made a point to bring a tutor from Palestine with a specification that this person must not know any English or French. Russian or Polish didn't matter, but so that we could speak only Hebrew at home, which we did. My first language was Hebrew.
So when you spoke to your parents, to your sisters, your brother, you spoke in Hebrew growing up?
We spoke in Hebrew, but after we started going to school, which was French school, the school of the Suez Canal Company. The company was French at that time, and all our schooling, primary and secondary, was in French. Hebrew was learned with a tutor at home.
And did your family, while you were growing up, did you visit?
Oh yes, we'd come very often to Moza, which is where my grandparents on my mother's side settled. And sometimes we went to Neve Tzedek, which my father's parents, where my father's parents lived. And the house still exists there. I have to go and check the number one day. But
How did you travel? How did you get to...
there was a train from Egypt to Palestine. And it was beautiful at dawn when you arrived and you saw that cerulean sea and the palm trees on the coast. It was a lovely trip.
So you would come to visit, and your grandparents still lived in...
To both families, on my father's side in Neve Tzedek, and on my mother's side in Moza, in the Judean hills. At that time, about 15 minutes by bus from Jerusalem. There was a Jewish bus and there was an Arab bus. so you had always transportation available. And
What year were you born?
1921.
And when you were growing up, did your parents talk about? Did they talk about going back to Palestine? Was this something
Always.
temporary or?
Always. בשנה הבאה בירושלים. But my father developed such business interests in Egypt that we came to Palestine to visit the grandparents, or during the war, always summer holidays, because you couldn't go to Europe. So in the winter, both grandparents from my father's side and my mother's side took it in turn to come and stay with us in Israelia on the Suez Canal.
What was the Jewish community like in Israelia?
Insignificant. Totally insignificant. My father's brother-in-law, married to his sister, was working at the Suez Canal Company. There were hardly any Jews there, except in the village of Ismailia, the Arab part, totally dissociated from the European part. That was the times. And the whole city spoke French, because the administration of the Suez Canal Company was French, and they had a cooperative, and they had doctors, they had everything, like a very independent administration. And we were connected with it through my father, who was head of the electricity and ice supply company, a company that was Swiss.
Did you travel in Egypt at all when you were younger?
Upper Egypt, Suez, Port Said. If you took a boat to Europe, Port Said, Suez for other reasons. And along the canal, you had a road.
What were the relationships like with the local, the non-European community? Did you have anything to do with?
Well, they had what they called the Arab village, and the Suez Canal Company was very detached from that. They had their own administration, their own cooperative for food, their own hospital. It was a very colonial setup.
Did your parents talk about Zionism at all? Did they talk about
Oh, what do you mean? That was our life. Israel, the blue pushke, the little blue box with the Magen David, and more important than that, a tutor was brought every year or 2 years from Palestine with the stipulation that the woman must not know any European language. If she knew Polish, that didn't matter to us, or Russian, but neither French nor English, to force us to speak, all of us, Hebrew at home.
Did you go to? You went through elementary school and high school also
Yes, primary and secondary education at a French school of the Suez Canal Company.
What place are you with are you younger than your siblings or older?
I have, my brother's dead now, but he was number one. And then I came after, the first daughter, and then another a sister Tzila, and another sister Ora Herzog.
And they all also went to the same schools? To the
Yes,
same...
yes.
And so growing up...
Except Ora, who went to an English school. She chose to go to an English school. Tzila, my number two, and myself stayed with a French school all the way to the baccalaureate.
So...
But by that time, we were in Cairo.
Okay. So when did you...
When I was 14, my parents moved to Cairo because my father's company wanted him in Cairo. So it turned out to be very useful to us because there was a real Jewish community there.
So what was that like, the Jewish community?
Uninterested in Palestine. They laughed at my father because he was a Zionist. And they said, "What are you going to do with that?" And my father said, "Well, I was born in Palestine, and I grew up in Palestine, and I've kept all my business connections with Palestine, and that's how I am." And my mother, the same thing. She was born in Jerusalem. And I don't know if you remember what is called Habayit Adom in Moza. That was my grandfather's. It was the brick and tile factory of Israel, of Palestine, and every tile was stamped Steinberg, Moza. So there must be still old houses that have a roof with Steinberg Moza somewhere. But I saw it, I remember it. And we used to come and spend the summer sometimes there. We went up to the vineyard, surrounded by grapes and more grapes and more grapes. And I also liked to hear at night when they burned the bricks in the big furnace, the Arab watchman had to watch all night because you could see the flames in the fire. And I could hear him from my bedroom singing all night in Arabic and sometimes with a flute, just to keep himself going.
In 1936,
Yeah.
when do you remember? Were there difficulties in Palestine?
Yeah.
From the
There were
Arabs?
29 and 36. 29, the family in Moza suffered terribly. There was a big slaughter of the Maklef family. Maklef was the second chief of staff. And we lived up on the hill, and the Maklef family was down in the valley, and opposite was the hill with the Arab village of Colonia. And one Shabbat, my grandparents saw lots and lots of cars coming up the hill opposite in the village of Colonia, and within a short time they ran down the hill, Itbach, you know what that means? And they slaughtered people in Moza. It was terrible, terrible. And my grandparents were saved by the British, who came when they, I don't know who informed them or how they knew about it, and took them in an army British car and got them out of Moza. But my grandfather's brother got a bullet or whatever it is that you get from a gun in his arm, and there was no penicillin in those times. He was in hospital 3 months just because he got shot in the arm. shot in the arm now. Okay, we understand.
I understand. So when after you finished school in Cairo, did you go to university there?
Yeah, American University in Cairo. There's two, one in Beirut and one in Cairo. They are semi-missionaries, but not like Catholic missionaries. They have sense of propagating their culture and their religious, but not like the French who really worked at converting you, etc. And as a matter of fact, it was interesting when my father took my brother to the friars, which was the only French school there, because that was the Suez Canal Company school. And he said to the director, "Je vous apporte mon fils pour l'éduquer, mais pas pour le convertir. I bring you my son to educate him, but not to convert him." He wanted to make it clear.
What did you study?
And I went to French nuns of the order of Saint Vincent, which exists even in America. It exists to this day. And that was my French education came from there. At home, Hebrew. Later on, English.
What did you study in university?
Social sciences.
Did you know what you wanted? Have thoughts about what you wanted to do in the future, or where you thought you would be at the time?
I wanted to get married, like a good Jewish girl.
Okay, so we can talk about that.
Well, I studied at the American University in Cairo, and that was in English, and all my primary and secondary education was in French. So English became more prominent. Then, of course, after I married my husband in Cairo, we got married in Cairo, English was much more used than French.
Well, why don't you tell me how you met?
How we met? We met because during the war, my father sent my mother and my two sisters and myself to her family in South Africa, in Johannesburg, because the Germans were advancing all through North Africa near Tobruk. The father thought that's enough, and he thought if he's one man alone, he would stay behind because he had all sorts of business things. He sent us to South Africa, the three girls and mother. Mother had a brother there, and I don't know how we came to that.
You were starting to say, I want to hear about that. And then, so how long did you stay there?
6 months.
6 months in South Africa. Yeah. And this is when you were already...
No, I hadn't met my husband then.
You were in university at the time, or you'd finished?
Yes, in the American University in Cairo.
So then you spent part of the war there, and then...
Only 6 months.
And then when...
Came back.
Danger had passed, so you came back.
So father stayed on. And he said, mother and the three girls can come back. But my two sisters decided to stay in South Africa and finish their year at Witwatersrand University. And I went back with mother.
Okay, and then, so how did you meet your husband?
How did I meet my husband? My father met my husband first. When we were in South Africa, my father couldn't bear the house so empty. We had 3 pianos, everybody was doing their piano, their Hebrew, their English, God knows what. And I came back with mother after, I think, 3 months. And my sisters decided to stay and study there. And when we were away, father had gone for a while to Jerusalem, and our doctor, my mother's doctor, because she was quite sick at one point, my mother's doctor from Hadassah, a German doctor, a Jewish doctor, and had invited my father, who was alone, to dinner. And a young man was there, a Captain Eban, who knew Ober's family because his father, not the real biological father, but his Eban father, was a doctor in London. And this doctor in Jerusalem knew the doctor in London. And he'd invited my husband and invited my father. And my father said casually to my future husband, whom I didn't know at all, he said, you see, you seem to travel between Palestine and Egypt. When you are in Egypt, come and call on us. And my father took it literally. And he wrote a letter. I met you at Dr. Kleberg, who was a very famous doctor in Jerusalem. I'm now stationed in Cairo. Can I come and visit you?
And so then you came back from South Africa.
Yeah, I was already back.
Okay. And,
yeah. No, but father had invited him before mother and I came back.
Okay. And do you remember the first time that you met?
Yeah, I do.
He
talked to my father because they talked politics, but he looked at me. So I understood that he was paying attention.
He might come back again.
He might come back again. And that time he came with an Air Force Jewish boy, the two of them together, because they shared an apartment in Cairo. The second time he came alone. And then things developed.
And you called him, his name?
Major Eban. And then one day he said, don't you think you should call me by my name? Aubrey? I said, okay. And then I think what struck him, really, was that we entertained a lot of Jewish soldiers from Palestine who volunteered during the war to serve in the British Army, to serve in Europe.
Did you ever meet, this is a side question, did you ever meet Professor Orbach, Professor Ephraim Orbach?
Not that I remember.
Okay, because he was the chaplain of the British, the Jewish chaplain in the British Army at the time in North Africa.
But the man who was the chaplain at the time Aubrey and I got married was fabricant.
Uh-huh.
And we had the chief rabbi of Egypt for me and fabricant for Aubrey. So we had a double blessing.
Okay. So at that, Aryeh was stationed in Cairo, and for how long? How long was that?
A long time, till he was appointed to head the Middle East Center of Arab Studies that the British set up in Jerusalem to teach a team of 25 officers carefully selected to study Arabic, Arab literature, and who would be later on serving in the Middle East. And the chief of that school, how did they call it? Middle East Center of Arab Studies, that's how they called it. He had been the governor of Oman, British governor. And he showed us his Arab robes, like somebody shows you their pictures or whatever. And he was the governor.
Yeah, but when you got married, though, when you were still in Cairo.
Yeah, in Cairo.
When did you get married?
In 1945, in 18th of March.
In 1945. Okay, and then...
But we knew each other, except Aubrey was Jerusalem, Cairo, Jerusalem, etc., etc.
So when you got married, you lived in Cairo initially?
No,
Oh.
in Jerusalem.
Oh, by that point already?
By then he was serving in the Middle East
Okay.
Center of Arab Study as a tutor of Arabic culture, civilization, etc. But they had real Arabs teaching Arabic as a language, because these people were going to serve the British Empire in all the Arab states.
Where did you live in Jerusalem when you got married?
We lived, my husband made the point that we live in the Jewish part, because the school was in the Arab part, in the old city, what was then called the Austrian Hospice. But we lived in Talpiot, North Talpiot.
And your family stayed in
אתה צריך משהו?
אני רק מים, תודה. תודה רבה.
your family stayed in Egypt?
Yes.
Your sisters also?
And what?
Your sisters also were stayed?
No, my sisters were in South Africa. They decided to
Oh, they
to
stayed there.
further. Yeah. Then they came back. My sister number 2 was at my wedding in Cairo. And the other one met Herzog when he was serving in the British Army. And he had come to us. We lived in North Talpiot, in
Okay.
Jerusalem. And he said he was going to Cairo. I don't know anybody there.
Wait, how did you know him in...
Oh, he knew
he-
Aubrey, of course. And Aubrey used to visit the rabbi and, you know. So he said, call on my wife's family.
We've heard this story before.
So what?
We've heard this story already, right? We saw
Yeah.
what happened the first time somebody said that.
Yeah.
So that's how they met.
She opened the door for him. And they fell in love. Much quicker than I did.
Did you remember? Do you remember his father, Rabbi Herzog?
Yes, of course.
What was?
Serious, I only talk to the Rebbitzin.
Okay, so now you're living in Jerusalem. It's 1945
In North Talpiot.
in North Talpiot. Do you remember what street?
It had one street. 7 houses. You went up the hill. You passed a monastery, Saint Clair, a women's monastery. And then you came into North Talpiot. There were 7 houses or whatever it was. And we were all robbed one night by the Arab village on the hill opposite. And at 2 a.m., everybody was in their best nightshirts outside, trying to see what had happened. And my husband used to, every night on the windowsill, put the change, the grushim, and so that it's not in his bag. And he suddenly heard somebody tapping on the window and moving the money. And he rushed out, but of course the Arab thief had already gone away. A very small neighborhood. No telephone. We used to have to go to the house of Mr. Kalvarisky, who was of the Sochnut, so he had the telephone. And a nice, dear old fellow. And that's about it.
Were you working at this point, or what were you, and how long did his appointment at this Middle Eastern center?
Oh, by the end of the war, he knew he was going back to England. And he didn't know what he was going to do yet. But he had to report to get demobilized and then to do what he wanted. But all the time he kept in touch with Moshe Sharet, and with Ben-Gurion too, certainly with Teddy Kollek.
What was his connection to them? From
Zionist. He was head of Zionist youth in England.
Mm-hmm. So then you went to
He
England?
was already involved.
But he was involved before the war, and then after the war.
During the war, and he was in a unit connected with Mishmar HaEmek, where there was Yigal Alon and a whole project of parachuting Palestinians, Jews, into Europe as a kind of secret movement.
After the war, then you went to England?
At the end of the war, yes, we went to England. Because he had joined the Jewish Agency, to everybody's surprise.
Why were they surprised? What did they think he would do?
Go back to Cambridge, teach Oriental languages, at which he came out with a triple first. In England, it's when you're special, you have a double first. He had a triple first. So he didn't find his way yet, but he talked to the Sochnut, especially Moshe Sharet was very close to us. And he knew that he would join the Jewish agency in London. Not go back to Cambridge, nothing of the sort.
So what did he do in London at the time?
What did I do?
What did he do? You moved to England,
Yeah.
and how long were you there?
This sent him, I think, to America about under a year after we were in London.
And you sent to America to do what?
Jewish agency,
Jewish agency.
defending Israel at the UN. There was no Israel yet. It was a Sochnut. And there was a mission. And at the head of it was Rabbi from Cleveland,
Abba Hillel Silver.
Abba Hillel Silver.
Okay, so what? So when you got, so then you stayed in England and then you moved to.
We moved to New York.
Tell me about that a little bit. What was that like?
New York, we were, at that time, because the war wasn't finished yet, you could stay in the hotel only 3 nights. There was such a shortage of hotel rooms because the Allied and the this and that in America was suddenly more important than Europe. So finally my husband spoke to the Consul General, who was a friend of ours, Arthur Lurie. I don't know if you knew him. And he said, look, my wife is going to have a baby, and we don't think it's suitable to have a baby in a hotel. The baby will cry at night. Somebody will knock on this door. And in the afternoon, somebody will on the other wall. So he said, we must find a place for him. And here's our Consul General. He was a great personal friend of ours also. He knew the important Jews in real estate in New York. And he said to them, look, Eban, his wife is going to have a baby, and they don't want to have the baby in a hotel. So they found a little charming penthouse. And we had a room for ourselves, a room for the baby, and a sitting room, dining room. 3 rooms.
What year was this? That
the war was finished 1945. We left 1945, before the end of the war.
Okay. So in 1947,
Yeah.
right? There was you were already in New York,
Yeah.
and leading up to the period of the UN, they had set up the UN Special Committee on Palestine.
Yeah, but we were only observers. We had no status. We had no state yet.
Was
No membership at the UN. That came later.
right, but at that time,
Yeah.
was Abba was working in the UN, and
No, not in the UN. In the Israeli mission to the UN. On the Zionist side, not on the British side. He had a British nationality. But he pleaded for the Jewish side. He was very close to Sharet, to the whole administration of the Sochnut.
no. So what was it like?
And he married a wife from a Zionist family.
What was it like, though, with the tensions that were starting to mount
Oh,
with
yes.
the British?
Yes.
How?
Oh, I remember when the King David, the explosion of the King David, and when I met in the street, and because he wore a British uniform, we could get through the British soldiers that were lined up Rehov Yafo. And we could get to our little house in Tzfon Talpiot, simply because he had a British uniform. But everybody was, I describe it in my book, everybody was running in every direction because they wanted to get home before the curfew.
And with the end of the war,
Yeah.
and the white paper still in effect,
Mm-hmm.
and refugees trying to come to Palestine, do you remember the diplomatic involvement?
Yes,
or was-
because we were on the side of the Sochnut. He worked very closely with Moshe Sharet, with the whole setup of the Sochnut.
And then,
And the British knew that he is for.
okay, but then you went to
London.
to London, and then to New York.
To London for a good while. To head, he was supposed to head the information office, Israeli information office in New York.
And when the UN finally decided to set up a committee to deal with the question of Palestine,
Special Committee on Palestine.
was he involved in that at all?
Of course. But he was not head of the mission. There was the Cleveland Rabbi,
Abba Hillel said
Rabbi Hillel. He was the impressive head, and we had no status yet.
And then what were the results of that committee? What happened then? What were the what happened as an outgrowth of that committee? That was what led up to finally bringing.
Yes, the vote at the UN for a Jewish state.
Do you remember those
Oh,
days?
yes, I
What
do
was,
remember.
Tell me a little bit about.
Yeah, people were, after the vote, people were crying. People were embracing.
How about, do you remember the days before the vote? There must
We
have been a
were
lot
scra-
of.
Yeah, for instance, France. France had בהתחלה voted against. And then Weizmann was quickly involved to speak to Léon Blum, who was then the Jewish Prime Minister in France, and to others to get France to vote yes. So on the first round, France voted no. On the second round, it voted yes, because the French delegate, Parodi, was asked by Weizmann to his hotel, and he told him what he thought the French, who saw what happened with the Jews in Germany, etc., should vote for this. And we got them to vote, not on the first round, the second round.
What was Abba's role in
He was, we didn't, there was no, Silva was head of the mission, but it was a Jewish agency mission.
But once it was coming toward the vote, so was he
Well,
working?
eventually it was voted, the state was voted, and then when it was voted, Abba and everybody in the mission, you spoke to the Belgian and you spoke to the Swede and you spoke to the Brazilian, etc., etc. So Ober said to Sharet, what do I do now that we've had the vote? He said, you stay here and you be head of the mission. Pashut.
Were you there? Were you at the UN?
Yes, I followed the whole thing. I was there with him.
Tell me what that was like to be. So many people have told us, that they were following on the radio and listening to the count and
Yeah, the count, oh my God.
Oh.
I have a paper upstairs with the countries and the count.
What was it like? What was it like to be there when?
Nerve-wracking. Because every vote counted, because some people promised and voted against. So, some people were pursued by us till the last minute and voted for. One man, we had a man who was in charge of the Latin American votes. And there was a South American country, I don't want to tell you which, and I don't also remember which one it was. So our head of the Latin group, the Sochnut, had an Argentinian Jew who was in the Mishlachat. So he went to the men's room and he recognized the men's shoes under the door. And he knocked and he said, you promised to vote. They are voting now. I'm here to bring you to the voting. And he voted.
Wow.
Here it is. That's the paper.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
That's the paper with the votes.
You show it. Can you hold it?
בבקשה. אני רחוק מדי?
לא, זה בסדר. That's the
לא
original.
צריך את זה. רגע, אני קצת רועדת
לא, זה בסדר.
מהתרגשות.
כן. Thank you.
So you were sitting there with this piece of paper.
בוצי, תודה רבה, ויש חתימה של ויצמן ושל טרומן למעלה. ראית?
מדהים.
אלונור רוזוולט, ואבא הלל סילבה, משה שרת, אליעזר קפלן, עמנואל ניומן, אייזק, משהו הרצוג, הלוי, זה הרב הראשי, רוז הלפרין שהייתה ראש ההדסה וגם חברה בסוכנות, נחום גולדמן, אבא הלל סילבה ודוד בן גוריון ואבא איבן. זאת ההצבעה. בוצי, כל הכבוד לך שידעת איפה זה.
Oh, you have a few more here. Ralph, how do you pronounce his last name?
רלף בנץ' שהיה מזכיר, והשני ג'יימס מקדונלד. אתה זוכר? הוא היה השגריר הראשון של ארצות הברית, והוא היה ראש Refugees Organization after the war. רב אלוף דורי, הרמטכ"ל הראשון, ואחר כך מי זה פה? ברטלי קראם, היה אמריקאי, עיתונאי אמריקאי, שהוא היה חלק מהמשלחת עם בנץ' ואחרים. ופה יש עמנואל ניומן של הסוכנות, אליעזר קפלן, the financial man, ארת'ר לורי, משה שרת, רוז הלפרין, משה שרת עם הטף ככה, תמיד שמתי לב על הטף. משה שרת.
Wow.
Do you see that?
Yeah.
אבא הלל סילבה ונחום גולדמן. ודוד בן גוריון, פרופסור פבריגט מאורוגוואי, אורוגוואי, כן, אני חושבת ש...
הוא היה מיונסקו.
מה?
מהוועדה של האו"ם, ועדת יונסקו.
כן, כן. אבל זה אורוגוואי או ארץ אחרת? לא, אורוגוואי היה, אני זוכרת, אחר, גרנדוס. כל הכבוד לך. וזהו. וטריגווילי, Secretary General of the UN. זה מפני שבוצי ידע איפה לחפש את זה, אני לא יודעת איפה. יש ארכיון גדול פה.
Did you go to Palestine with the
Yeah, with the Anscop.
with UNSCOP?
Yeah, of course.
What was it like? Did they seem
No, I didn't travel everywhere. I knew the country. It was a tremendous thing for me to see my parents and my sister Aura and so, and Aubrey, of course, was involved with. He took them to see the Exodus, the vote.
so the boat was in
He took the mission.
to go see the Exodus?
What?
To go see the Exodus that was
Yeah, to.
when it came time for the vote. Do you remember, was he optimistic? Was he nervous? Was he
Nervous, no, because some people promise and don't, and some people, for instance, the Prince of, don't use it, the Prince of Thailand, the delegate, he had instructions not to vote for us, so he was due to go on the Queen Elizabeth or Queen Mary, one of the transatlantic ships. He asked permission to go on the ship 2 days before, not to vote against.
Do you know Uri Lubrani?
Who?
Uri Lubrani.
Yes, of course.
He told us a story about the Philippines, trying to get the Philippines.
Let me hear.
Somebody had promised.
I think it's
With France and with the chase after the votes was not funny.
And when it finally happened,
When?
when you counted up the votes,
Yeah.
So did you celebrate?
Yeah, it worked afterwards.
Did you celebrate though?
Well, of course, it was a future of the Jewish people. These were fantastic moments, absolutely unforgettable. The tension, the almost obsequiousness to people to make sure they are on our side.
It must have been
And
amazing.
preaching, explaining why all the time. And the refugees and the displaced people, do you remember they call them displaced person in Europe? It was touch and go all the time till you got everything lined up.
What do you think if there had to be a vote today with the UN? What do you think they would?
It's a different UN. We had Tryggvi then from Norway, who was very much for us. Today I don't know. There's some Asian who I've forgotten his name, you know.
Tissue?
Yeah, could you help me?
אני עושה הפסקה.
Here, you think about Israel.
Firsthand.
Firsthand, people who were there, people who,
Yeah.
like, like even the UN.
And I remember Senator Austin head of the American delegation. They had sometimes this one, and he said to my husband, "It's touching to see how your wife comes out for every session."
It's funny.
Because the wives stayed, but this was our life.
Amazing. And then,
I'm happy myself to have it מתועד.
Yes.
and then you said that
תמשיך.
מה יש? הוא רוצה להפסיק.
לא. הוא
היה
ממשיך,
מקום
אנחנו
אחד,
מדברים.
סוזי, שפתאום ככה נחתך לך קו המחשבה, וזה היה מאוד יפה שאת אמרת, and how did we get to that? וכאילו הוא הזכיר לך, את מבינה? שאת שוכחת, אז תגידי לו ככה, אוי, איפה היינו? כאילו, ואז הוא יעשה...
You said, what do we do now, right? What,
We sat in the car, Sharet, my husband and myself, from Lake Success to Manhattan, and nobody said a word. It was overpowering. Nobody said a word. The three of us.
wow.
It was too big for... Isn't it wonderful that שטויות. It was a very dramatic day. We had many dramatic moments there.
At that point, did you know that you were going to be staying in America? Did you know that you were going to be staying there for a while?
We went with the issue. And when the session was finished, the fall session, and the UN broke up because it was Christmas, it was whatever. So Ober said to Sharet, "What do I do now?" And he said, "You stay right here."
How did it feel to be now the representatives? I guess it wasn't the state yet. It was still just the partition had been approved, but the state was around the corner.
Yeah.
How did it feel to be representing Israel? Or it wasn't
Well,
even Israel,
we
it was
were the
Palestine.
youngest. He and I were the youngest that is head of mission,
How old was he?
33. You're very tactful not to ask how old I was.
I know.
I wish I could remember. I don't. I remember the excitement. But I was in my early 20s, that's all. And it was fantastic. Overpowering. There you were sitting, and there your country was forming itself as a country. War in Israel, the military side, and it's all very nice. But after you achieve militarily, what's next?
Diplomacy.
Or what's on the way? Or what's before? The political side.
What was the next battle? Trusteeship? What was the next?
Oh yes, there was a virulent battle on trusteeship, especially as Truman was first for trusteeship. And then Weizmann hit a part here.
No.
He went to see Truman. He got out of his sick bed, and they said, "Kadima." And he went.
He got the.
And he called him the old doctor. He respected him. the old doctor. He never called Weizmann, probably. He couldn't pronounce Weizmann. Anyway, he said the old doctor. And the mission was not sympathetic. State Department. אף פעם לא. אף פעם, all along the way. We knew them, we were friends and this and that. But אחד לא שייך לשני. America was not a friend. The mission.
And Weizmann convinced.
Then Weizmann had an important part here.
Did you know Weizmann well?
I was 20-something. He was 70-something. It's not exactly. I remember once they were having a discussion, and I said something. My husband, Dr. Weizmann, Maya Weisgol, myself, and I said something. And Dr. Weizmann said to me, "I always knew you were an intelligent woman," very sarcastically. In other words, "Al titarvi po." שם אותי במקום.
When it came time, I guess it was already now, it was coming close to May of 1948.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It's coming closer to May 1948. The mandate is supposed to end, but you still don't know what is going to happen exactly, right? You don't know what is going to happen. You're still waiting. This is when.
Well, we understood we are going towards a state.
So what was the issue with Truman? How did that play out? After Weizmann came, then he.
I don't remember this at this moment.
Okay.
I have to reread and refresh my memory.
And when you were, now it came time for May 14th, and Ben-Gurion declared the state. What was that like for being in the
The
representative?
Jewish world was bursting, simply bursting, and crying and laughing, or very strong emotional moments.
Did people try and contact you because you and your husband were Israel in the United States? You were the ones who.
That's right, but Charette was in the picture, and
Did people congratulate?
yes, of course. The excitement were people, those who sat in the gallery at the UN, they jumped up. They were so excited. Some crying.
And when in May, when the state was declared,
Mm-hmm.
do you remember anybody interesting that called to congratulate? Your husband was now the ambassador, right?
Not yet.
Not yet.
If there wasn't a state yet, he was head of mission, minister, plenipotentiary, whatever, but not an ambassador yet. But as soon as it was declared, Charette said he would be the head of the mission.
And And what about becoming ambassador to the United States?
I remember a telephone call at midnight. Aubrey was, I don't know if Charette was in Atlanta or Aubrey. I think Aubrey was in Atlanta. And Charette asked Aubrey, האם אתה מוכן לקחת את התפקידיים?
And he knew what that meant.
He knew, so he called me. He said, yeah, but I'd like to speak to Suzy. So he called me and he said, what do you think? I said, well, what do you want? He said, if he's asking me, it means he wants to give it to me. So I said, okay. So we'll do it. And there was another ambassador, the ambassador of New Zealand, who was both at the UN and in Washington. So we knew that there was a precedent like that. The ambassador of Iceland, also at the UN, and ambassador in Washington. Perhaps one or two more, but I don't remember. These I do remember because we work closely on votes.
When did he go from being Aubrey to Abba?
Charette decided. And now that there's a state, you have to have a Jewish name. No Aubrey anymore. And he said, I think Abba would be suitable. And from Aubrey to move to Abba. So it became Abba Eban.
Do you remember, was Israel immediately accepted to the UN? And was there some kind of ceremony when it became part of the UN, or just that there was just something that?
I can't remember very precisely.
סוזי, יעל אומרת שאולי בתמונה הזאת,
כן,
זה מזכיר...
זה שאנחנו שמנו את הדגל.
איפה זה? איפה?
באו"ם.
זה...
זה שרת, הקונסול הכללי, אבא דוד הכהן from חיפה, וגדעון רפאל ששנים אחר כך היה השגריר, וזה ארת'ר לורי שהיה הקונסול הכללי. חבל שאין לנו השנה פה, והחודש...
Yael says it's May 1949.
אוקיי. יש לך בספר? כן. אוקיי. זה רגע, כי זה היה מאבק על הכנסת ישראל כמדינה באו"ם.
There was a fight about that?
Yeah, yeah. Because the Arabs...
Even though the UN had helped create the state...
זה לא שייך, זה לא שייך. זה whatever majority you get, that's how you get, how you travel in the UN.
What was it like living in New York?
What was it like in New York? In what way?
Was it the life of being a diplomat's wife?
But the diplomatic life of the UN and Washington are totally different. In Washington, you have to go to all the national days. I mean, not everybody, but the countries that matter to you. In New York, you go there as a couple in Washington. In New York, if your husband wants to represent, it's enough.
Did you move to Washington?
What?
Did you move to Washington?
Yes, of course, we did.
So what was that like? Having to do-
Ellie, my little boy, 50 now, we moved, the three of us. I came at 10 p.m. to Washington because it was so difficult to wind up the place in New York with the papers and the books and the this and the that and the baby's things. And I took my little Ellie on my arms and landed in Washington at 10 p.m. because I couldn't finish earlier that day.
You had to go to all of these dinners and...
Yes, because it's a small community in Washington. So we choose the countries that mattered to us. And the Arabs certainly didn't invite us, so that was quite a group out. And countries like India, also we tried to cultivate and to show some gesture.
Did you enjoy that?
No. You have to dress. You have to go to every national day, parties and all that kind of thing. And the first thing is the wives of ambassadors. I have to call on wives of ambassadors, and they have to return the call to me. So it's quite an occupation. But that's the procedure in the diplomatic service. And it's useful because my husband, or every diplomat's husband, every diplomatic couple, the husband can't meet everybody. So when you come to a cocktail party where you have to go, you get your husband to meet some other ambassador because you already know the wife. And so מגלגלים עניינים.
How long did you stay in Washington?
We came there and we left in 59. 8 years and a half, 9 years.
And when you came back to Israel,
Yeah.
did you know what you were going to do next? Did you know where you were going to go?
Minister of Foreign Affairs. Whatever they tell you. Then Golda resigned and my husband took over.
Where did you move to?
To Balfour Street. That used to be the foreign minister's house, and Sharet was there. And then Leah Rabin came on the scene, and she said, that's not a house for the foreign minister. That will be the house for the prime minister. So the foreign minister entertains in a hotel. His wife probably likes it.
When
Stoch.
when did you become involved in the Machon Weizmann and the Weizmann Institute when you came back to Israel?
Oh yes. We entertained a lot because my husband was president, which was it was very subtle of Meyer Weisgorn. Before Aubrey came back from diplomatic service of 9 years, Maya asked him to be president of the Weizmann Institute. And that was a big help to us because it gave us our base. Because when we came to Jerusalem after we got married, we had an apartment of 3 rooms. I didn't entertain, I couldn't do anything like that. So Maya liked to have this. Did you know him? Anyway, he was a very dominant figure in the Weizmann Institute, absolutely 100% loyal to Weizmann. And he was loyal also politically, because between Weizmann and Ben-Gurion, it wasn't always ideal. So there was quite a game there. So we were there till 8 years at the Weizmann Institute as president, and Maya played a political card here. Because, for instance, there was a man, I've forgotten his name, who came from London to be head of a scientific department at the Weizmann, at the Hebrew University. And they gave him such a running around because he was not an Israeli and they wanted an Israeli. So he had to leave. So Weizmann felt, Maya Weisgau felt he wouldn't like to see Aubrey played with. So he offered him the presidency of the Weizmann Institute, no matter what. That was it. And that gave us a house, it gave us a role. And I enjoyed the scientific community. And Aubrey, that gave him a shield politically. Also, you see, there were rivalries between Weizmann and Ben-Gurion. So Maya didn't want Aubrey to fall between the 2 stools, because Ben-Gurion was the political head, Weizmann was the world head.
So where did he found himself in the Weizmann camp?
No, both.
Both.
As a diplomat, he knew how to play both.
Useful.
What?
That's useful.
Yeah.
And when you came back in '59,
yeah,
what did he do in the foreign ministry?
He was president of the institute, and he had the idea to do a big encounter between science and politics. And this was the Rehovot conference. I don't know if you ever heard about it. We invited heads of states or foreign ministers with heads of scientific institutions or prominent head like, what was his name? Not Blackwell, something from Cambridge, and other prominent scientific figures to meet, to encounter, to see how it works to put science and politics together. And it was quite an impressive thing, because afterwards every statesman had to have the scientific world at his side in modern countries. In
what year did did he join the Knesset for the first time?
1960, I think. There was very soon an election after we arrived. So at the beginning it was just the Weizmann Institute, but after the election in the fall, we arrived in summer, there was already an election in the fall, and Aubrey joined as minister without portfolio. He entered the cabinet that way.
In
אני לא שומעת.
do you want to take a break or keep
לא,
going?
אנחנו נמשיך קצת עוד. בואו נקבע עוד כמה זמן.
Okay, we'll a few more. I wanted to ask about
אגודה חשוב. נכון?
Aguda.
למען הסרטן.
כן.
We'll get to the. I promise to ask.
נו, אמרתי לו בהתחלה
כן, זה
שאני לא יכולה לוותר על זה.
לא רק אשתו שלי. כן.
I wanted to ask about the 6-day war.
Yeah.
Any, if you have memories from that, what Abba was, his role in the government, and
It's interesting how if you want to be rational, sometimes it's very tough. What happened is that I think I'm too tired.
okay.
Okay.
Do you want to take a break?
But I'd
or
like,
I wanted
I'd
to
like
ask
to talk about it because the המתנה. זה souvenir from the מלחמת ששת הימים בירושלים בחצר שלנו. ויש לי צלחת גדולה שהבן שלי התחנן, כי הוא היה גם כן איתי. בעלי היה באום. ואני נשארתי עם הילדים ברחוב בלפור. אז בהפסקה, כשהיה all clear, רצנו לחצר והבאנו את אלה כשהם עוד היו חמים. אז הוא לקח צלחת גדולה, הוא אמר, אמא, you must give it to me.
ניתן לה אריה, כי זה אחד ביד, אולי רק רסיס, זה הכל זה כבד.
Wow.
אולי אני אחזיק את זה, כי זה אוי ואבוי, אם זה נוגע במישהו. זה היה בחצר, ואז אספנו את זה כשזה היה עוד חם. ביוזמת הילדים. זה היה בירושלים, ברחוב בלפור.
Let me just, I have a couple more questions, and then we can...
Yeah, okay.
One question I wanted to ask you was, returning to Egypt.
Yeah.
Did you have, you left Egypt when, before
For my marriage,
before your marriage, you grew up there.
yeah.
Did you have an opportunity to go back at any point to Egypt?
Yes, Begin took me back when he was asked by Sadat. And we happened to travel from London back to Israel on the same plane with Begin. And he talked politics with my husband, so on and so forth. And then he turned to me and said, שמעתי שאת נולדת בישמעאליה. אז אמרתי, כן. אז הוא אומר, אני הולך שם עם המטוס שלי. I adored it because he's such a צנוע, you know. וזה מטוס של המדינה. אז הוא אומר, אני הולך במטוס שלי של 80 איש סך הכל, ואני מזמין אותך, את רוצה לבוא?
This is the meeting where he's going to...
When he went to meet Sadat from one side of the canal to the other side. אז אמרתי, אני אשמח מאוד. אז כשהוא עזב...
If you don't mind in English.
Oh, sorry. When he left, there were two seats, my husband and myself, and Begin standing there, leaning on the edge of my husband's seat, and he said, do you want to come with me to Egypt in my plane? I love my plane. So I said, of course, to Ismailia, where I was born. So we didn't go everywhere, just Ismailia, from one side of the canal to the other side. So when he left us to go back to his seat, I said, forget about it, he'll go back to his office, יהיו ניירות ככה, וסוזי אבן, not at all. The next day, טלפון מלשכת ראש הממשלה, שהוא אוסף את כל הדרכונים בשביל נסיעתו למצרים, ומבקשים את הדרכון שלך, כי אנחנו נותנים את כל הדרכונים כחבילה אחת עם רשימת השמות. So I knew I was going.
You hadn't been there in...
No, I left when I got married, 45.
Yeah.
So I said to my husband, הוא בטח ישכח מזה או מעט. Not at all. So the house was demolished. I asked, he said, what do you want? In Ismailia. I was born in Ismailia. So what do you want to do in Ismailia? I said, I want to see the house where I grew up. So they said, fine. I had an appointment at a certain hour because they gave me a separate car. I came, I saw somebody who had a key. So I thought, זאת אומרת שאף אחד לא גר שמה. So I step in the house and it's full of dust. The staircase is half demolished, half still used. I went up the terrace upstairs overlooking the garden. The balatot were some yes, some no. Anyway, it was fantastic. I went there. When we lived there, the population was 15,000, and now it's 300,000. In the garden of the house where we lived, there's already a house in the property itself. The crowding is unbelievable. They were very nice, and they touched somebody who was their ambassador in Togo with the decoration, and it was quite moving. So you see the intelligence of the Egyptians. When we landed at El Ferdan, which I knew from the Suez Canal, El Ferdan, there was a woman with a black fur collar. It was winter. She was there to take care of me. She was Dr. Aziza, who'd been with me at the American University in Cairo, who was later the wife of the Egyptian ambassador in Washington. And I presented my husband to her. She presented her husband to me. And we never met again.
They did their homework.
It was before, but it was so fantastic. She was to take care of me. She spent the whole day. We were supposed to go back to Israel that night, but she had already made plans to go back to Cairo. She went back to Cairo. I stayed in the house that was the house of the president, the French president of the Suez Canal Company, and our chevre were all walking around with maps rolled up to talk about frontiers and troops and so on and so forth. We spent the night, which was not meant to be, in the residence of the winter residence of the president of the Suez Canal, a Frenchman. And that was it. The next day we all trooped out. Another chavaya. I wrote for the New Yorker. I wrote a piece for the New Yorker.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Looking back, 60 years or more involved in all kinds of, what are you most proud of?
My husband. It's as his wife that I enjoyed all the interesting political episodes and personal episodes.
How about your own contributions to?
Well, yes, I think I played a part, especially in Washington, where the woman counts a lot.
And how about here in Israel with your work with?
Well, Israel at the beginning was difficult.
And what about your work with cancer?
Oh, no, that went very well from the beginning. We had a little room at the doctor's place in Tel Aviv on the ground floor. One desk, one chair, one telephone.
When was this? When did you found this?
I can't remember. Not long after we arrived, in 1960. And they said they wanted me as president. And I said, no, I don't want to be president. So what will you be? I said, vice president, go and find the president. So I remember I went to Theater Yaglon, the president of Vitzo for many, many years, and on the Jewish Agency, powerhouse. So she said, what are you with the Cancer Association? I said, I'm vice president. She said, who is the president? She said, who is the president? There isn't one. She said, I think it's ridiculous. So I came home and I said to the director of the association, I think you were right. I'll be president. And then I was for many years. And I really helped them tremendously. I remember on one trip, we used to do, a yearly event for 27,000 pounds. I went to New York and I brought a whole department at Tel HaShomer. But the director of the hospital, of the Aguda, called me and she said, Tishmi, אף פעם לא היה לנו כסף כזה. חצי נשמור לקופה, חצי ניתן לתל השומר. So I said, okay, זה לקופה, זה בשביל האגודה. So we started there and we did wonderful things. We really did good things. Afterwards I had Billingson. I was very active and I felt rewarded by creating in Israel. So that's it.
Any last thoughts to anything else that you want to share? Anything having lived through being a witness to the founding of Israel? Any messages for your grandchildren about what that was like?
It's amazing that I survived it all because my husband was very absent-minded. I remember a friend of ours from Chicago who was, when we created Israel Bonds, he became very, very active. And there was a meeting in New York and Israel Bonds became the great thing. He spoke, he was so enthusiastic, he rushed and took the train back to Chicago and forgot his wife in New York. So this hasn't happened to me.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. This was fascinating.
Okay, well,
And we really appreciate all the time.
thank you. It's nice to talk about the past. פה יש הרבה דפים שמציינים תרומתי לאגודה למלחמה בסרטן, שהייתי 38 שנים הנשיאה. התחלנו מחדר קטן בתל אביב, עם טלפון אחד, שולחן אחד, כיסא אחד. ארצי, חשוב, הקש בדלת, מי לא שמע על זה, והילדים של הילדים ימשיכו הקש בדלת.
מה זה? מה אנחנו רואים פה?
זה תעודה שכשעזבתי את האגודה, הוקרה, וכמו שאתה רואה באנגלית, Certificate of Appreciation.
אוקיי.
זה בבית הנשיא, כשעזר היה נשיא, ובני גאון היה פעיל מאוד באגודה, לצערנו הוא נפטר מסרטן. ואתם רואים את הסמל של המדינה, ואני הסדרתי את המסורת שהנשיא מקבל פעם בשנה את הנהלת האגודה. האמא שלו הייתה חברה טובה שלי,
איך קוראים לו?
ליאון ריקנטי. והוא עד היום עוד וייס צ'יירמן, איך אומרים, סגן יושב ראש של האגודה למלחמה בסרטן. אני הייתי אז הנשיאה. אלי הורוביץ מטבע היה ראש הקש בדלת. כל שנה אנחנו מכבדים מישהו מהתעשייה או מהכלכלה, או מהפוליטיקה אפילו, והוא יושב ראש הקש בדלת, המפעל הארצי שלנו, ש50,000 מתנדבים יוצאים להתרים את האנשים למען האגודה. משרד הבריאות באותו זמן, וזה גברת ריקנטי, מטילדה, האימא של ליאון, שהיינו חברות בעבודה. וחברות.
אוקיי.
כשחזרנו ארצה אחרי התפקידיים באום ובשגרירות. אז הנה המשפחה חוזרת לישראל, באל על. יש לי תמונה אחת.
כן, בבקשה.
היה ביקור באמן, אצל המלך והמלכה, אצל חוסיין. אצל חוסיין, מלך חוסיין והמלכה נור. והיה לזה חשיבות מיוחדת, כי בעלי היה נפגש איתו באופן סודי בלונדון הרבה שנים, איזה 7-8 פעמים. דיברו על המצב, על האפשרות, והתזה של חוסיין הייתה שהוא בתור מדינה קטנה לא יכול להיות היוזם של השלום. זה צריך לבוא ממדינה גדולה כמו מצרים, אבל בכל אופן לא דרכו. אם כי הוא מעוניין בזה מאוד, אבל הוא מרגיש שמדינה ערבית גדולה צריכה להיות הראשונה, והיה ברור למי הוא התכוון. ואני ישבתי עם המלכה נור בסלון שלה, וזאת הנסיכה, הבת של חוסיין. זה היה ליל סדר במכון ויצמן. הבת שלי גנבה את ההצגה, כי כולם היו דוברי אנגלית, מועצת המנהלים של המכון, שבאו מחוץ לארץ, וגילה עברה דרך האגדה כמו, אני לא יודעת, כמו שחקנית גדולה. הקריאה יפה, בטון ברור ובעברית, והאחרים קיבלו את זה, כי הרבה פשוט השתמשו בספר, מצד אחד בעברית, מצד אחד באנגלית.
בבקשה. בבקשה, סוזי.
פה מדובר באבן וסוזי, כסבא וסבתא. יש לך השנה 88. ופה אלי, האבא של יעל ועומרי.
בבקשה.
יום חתונתנו בקהיר. אבן היה מייג'ר בצבא הבריטי, ואני הייתי סטודנטית באוניברסיטה האמריקאית בקהיר.
מצוין. בבקשה.
ככה הכרתי את אבא אבן בתור קצין בריטי במלחמת העולם השנייה, ואני אוהבת את הצילום הזה, כי הוא כאילו מסתכל בעתיד, והיו לי חיים טובים מאוד איתו, ואני עד היום עוד מתגעגעת אליו.